The world knew Dean Martin as the effortlessly cool crooner who never seemed rattled by anything. But on one particular night in 1968, millions of viewers witnessed something they had never seen before, and would never see again. Behind that unshakable facade was a man carrying a weight that would eventually crush him. This is the story of how Dean Martin's carefully constructed image shattered in real time, and how the aftermath revealed a truth about fame, family, and the price of being the king of cool. The studio lights at NBC were hotter than usual that October evening. Dean Martin stood backstage at Studio 4, the familiar weight of his tuxedo jacket across his shoulders, a glass of what everyone assumed was whiskey in his hand. It was actually apple juice, a secret he'd kept from the public for years. The Dean Martin Show was at the height of its popularity, pulling in 23 million viewers every Thursday night. America tuned in to watch Dino do what he did best: sing, crack jokes, and make everything look easier than breathing. But tonight was different. Stage manager Tony Capello noticed it first. Dean's hands were trembling as he adjusted his bow tie. In 7 years of working together, Tony had never seen Dean nervous. Not when Sinatra showed up unannounced. Not when technical failures killed 3 cameras mid-broadcast. Not even when Senator Robert Kennedy appeared as a surprise guest just months before his assassination. Dean Martin didn't get nervous. That was his whole thing. 5 minutes, Mr. Martin, Tony said quietly. Dean nodded, but his eyes were somewhere else entirely. The glass in his hand trembled slightly, sending tiny ripples across the amber liquid. Tony pretended not to notice and walked away, but something cold settled in his stomach. Something was wrong. What the audience at home would never know, what even most of the crew didn't understand, was that Dean had received a phone call 4 hours earlier. It came through to his dressing room at 3:47 p.m. Pacific Time. His ex-wife Betty's voice on the other end was barely recognizable. Their son, Dean Paul Martin Jr., Dino, to the family, had been in an accident. Not life-threatening, the doctor said, but serious enough. A motorcycle crash on Mulholland Drive. Fractured ribs, possible concussion, and something about internal bleeding they were still evaluating. Dean had wanted to leave immediately. Drive to Cedars-Sinai, sit by his son's bedside, be the father he'd always struggled to be when the cameras weren't watching. But Greg Garrison, the show's producer, had talked him down. The kid's stable, Dean. Doctors said he's stable. You've got 300 people counting on you tonight. Crew, guests, musicians. We're live in 4 hours. You can't just. I know, Dean had said quietly. And he did know. The machine didn't stop for personal problems. It never had. So he stayed. The opening credits rolled at exactly 9 p.m. Eastern Time. Dean walked through the curtain to thunderous applause, that million-dollar smile fixed perfectly in place. The orchestra swung into Everybody Loves Somebody, and for the first 90 seconds, everything seemed fine. Dean hit his marks, delivered his opening jokes with the timing of a Swiss watch, and welcomed the audience like they were old friends gathered in his living room. Then he started to sing. The song was You're Nobody Till Somebody Loves You, one of his standards, a tune he could perform in his sleep. He'd sung it hundreds of times, in Vegas showrooms and recording studios, at the Sands and the Copacabana. The arrangement was familiar, comfortable, safe. But 16 bars in, something happened that nobody, not the musicians, not the director, not the 23 million people watching at home, had ever witnessed before. Dean Martin's voice cracked. Not a little wobble, not a momentary strain. It broke completely, mid-phrase, turning a smooth note into something raw and fractured. He stopped singing. Just stopped, right there on live television, the orchestra continuing for 2 more measures before the conductor frantically signaled them to cut. The silence that followed lasted only 4 seconds, but it felt eternal. Dean stood at the microphone, head slightly bowed, one hand gripping the stand with white knuckles. The studio audience sat in confused silence. In the control booth, Greg Garrison screamed into his headset, "Camera 2, tight on his face. Camera 2. But the cameraman, a veteran named Lou Tedesco, couldn't bring himself to zoom in. Something about the moment felt too private, too sacred to exploit. When Dean finally looked up, his eyes were wet. America had never seen Dean Martin cry. "I'm sorry, folks," he said softly, his voice thick with something that sounded like grief. I need a minute." He turned away from the audience, walked upstage toward the band, hand pressed against his forehead. The confusion in the studio was palpable. Audience members exchanged worried glances. The orchestra sat frozen, instruments half-raised, unsure whether to play or stay silent. Frank Sinatra, watching from his home in Palm Springs, immediately grabbed his phone and called NBC's main line. "What the hell is happening? Is Dean okay?" The switchboard operator had no answers. Nobody did. Greg Garrison made a split-second decision. He ordered the director to cut to commercial, an unscheduled break that would cost the network thousands of dollars. As the beer and cigarette advertisements filled living rooms across America, backstage at NBC Studio 4 became a controlled crisis zone. Dean had walked off stage and straight into his dressing room, locking the door behind him. Greg pounded on it. Dean, open up. We're back in 90 seconds. No response. Tony Capello pressed his ear against the door and heard something that made his blood run cold. Dean Martin was sobbing. Not quiet tears, but full-body, chest-heaving sobs that sounded like something breaking. "Get Betty on the phone," Greg barked at his assistant. "And get me a status update on the kid. Now." The commercial break ended. America returned to NBC expecting an explanation, or maybe a pivot to the next segment. Instead, they got something unprecedented, an empty stage. Just the orchestra, the elaborate set pieces, and a microphone stand casting a long shadow under the studio lights. The director, in a moment of either brilliance or panic, held the shot. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. 15. The audience at home watched an empty stage on live television, and the tension was unbearable. Some viewers thought their TVs had malfunctioned. Others assumed someone had died. Then Dean walked back out. He looked different. The cocky swagger was gone, replaced by something slower, heavier. His eyes were red but dry now, and when he reached the microphone, he didn't smile. He just looked directly into camera 1 and spoke in a voice that was quiet but somehow reached into every living room in America. "I want to apologize for that," he said. That's not like me. I'm supposed to be the guy who keeps it together, right?" A few nervous laughs from the studio audience. Dean smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "My son was in an accident today. He's okay, he's gonna be okay. But I got the call a few hours ago, and I thought I could just do what I always do. Put on the suit, sing the songs, make people smile." He paused, looking down at his hands. "But standing up here, singing about love and happiness while my kid's in a hospital bed. I couldn't do it. I couldn't pretend tonight." The studio audience was completely silent now. At home, millions of Americans sat frozen in front of their television sets, witnessing something they'd never seen before, vulnerability from a man who'd built an entire career on appearing invulnerable. "So here's what we're gonna do," Dean continued, his voice steadier now. "I'm gonna sing one more song tonight. Just one. And then I'm gonna get in my car and drive to Cedars-Sinai, and I'm gonna sit with my boy until he tells me to leave." He turned to the orchestra. "Fellas, let's do Somewhere There's a Someone." It was a song about longing, about searching for connection in a world that often feels impossibly lonely. And when Dean Martin sang it that night, his voice rough-edged and imperfect, the careful studio polish stripped away, it became something else entirely. It became a prayer. A confession. A glimpse into the real man behind the tuxedo and the carefully cultivated cool. When the song ended, Dean didn't wait for applause. He simply nodded to the audience, set the microphone back in its stand, and walked off stage. The show continued without him, guest stars filled the remaining 40 minutes, and Greg Garrison scrambled to restructure the entire program on the fly. But nobody watching really cared about the rest of the show. They just witnessed something far more important. NBC's switchboard was flooded with calls. Not complaints, expressions of support. Letters poured into the network over the following days, thousands of them, from viewers who'd been moved by Dean's honesty. "Thank you for being real," one letter read. "For showing us that even someone like you struggles." Another said, "I've watched your show for years, but tonight was the first time I felt like I actually knew you." But the industry response was different. More complicated. Frank Sinatra showed up at Cedars-Sinai at 11:30 that night. He found Dean sitting in a plastic chair outside his son's room, still in his tuxedo, tie loosened, looking every one of his 51 years. Frank sat down beside him without a word, and for a long time, they just sat there in the fluorescent hospital light. "That was something tonight," Frank finally said. Dean laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Yeah. Career suicide, probably." "Nah," Frank said quietly. "That was the most honest thing I've ever seen on television." Dean turned to look at him. "I broke, Frank. On live TV. In front of 23 million people. I looked weak." "You looked human," Frank corrected. "There's a difference." But Dean wasn't convinced. The next morning, Variety's headline read, "Martin's Breakdown, Career Crisis or Publicity Stunt?" The article speculated about substance abuse, mental instability, and whether NBC would renew his contract. Other crooners, competitors who'd spent years in Dean's shadow, circled like sharks. Bob Hope made a joke about it during his next special. Even some of Dean's friends, people who should have understood, whispered concerns about his reliability. The pressure to address it, to explain it, to spin it into something more palatable, was immense. Greg Garrison wanted Dean to do a follow-up statement, something that would clarify the situation and reassure sponsors. The network's publicity department drafted 3 different press releases. Dean rejected all of them. "I said what I needed to say," he told Greg. "I'm not apologizing for being worried about my kid." But privately, the incident shook him in ways he didn't fully understand at the time. For years, Dean had maintained a careful separation between his public and private selves. The Dean Martin that America knew, the carefree, boozy, woman-chasing swinger, was a character, a role he played so well that even people close to him sometimes forgot where the performance ended and the real man began. That night on NBC, the wall between those two selves had crumbled, and Dean didn't know how to rebuild it. His son recovered fully. Within 2 weeks, Dean Paul Martin Jr. was back home, ribs healing, concussion symptoms fading. He'd watched the broadcast from his hospital bed, and when his father visited the next day, he'd said something that stuck with Dean, "That was the most dad thing you've ever done on TV." "What do you mean?" Dean had asked. "You were actually you," his son replied. The ratings for that episode of the Dean Martin Show were the highest of the season. The following week's episode, where Dean addressed the incident with a simple, "Thanks for the letters, folks, the kid's doing great," pulled in even bigger numbers. America, it turned out, didn't want Dean Martin to be invincible. They wanted him to be real. But Dean struggled to reconcile that with everything he'd built his career on. Being the king of cool meant never showing cracks, never revealing the effort behind the effortlessness. It meant making everything look easy, even when it was impossibly hard. That breakdown, those 4 seconds of silence, those visible tears, had violated every rule he'd lived by. In the months that followed, Dean began to change in subtle ways. He started talking more openly in interviews about the challenges of balancing career and family. He admitted that the drinking persona was mostly an act, that the whiskey was often cold tea, that he rarely drank before performances. He spoke about loneliness, about the strange isolation that comes with fame, about how being recognized everywhere meant being truly known almost nowhere. Some fans loved this more vulnerable Dean Martin. Others felt betrayed, as if he'd broken a sacred contract by admitting the magic trick. Industry insiders debated whether his newfound openness was authentic or just another act, a savvy pivot to remain relevant in a changing cultural landscape. But the people closest to Dean knew the truth. Sammy Davis Jr., who'd been part of the Rat Pack and witnessed countless nights of Dean's carefully calibrated coolness, noticed the shift immediately. "He's letting us in a little now," Sammy told his wife. "Just a crack, but it's there. And it's about damn time." Jerry Lewis, Dean's former partner, with whom he'd had a complicated, painful split years earlier, sent a telegram after the incident. It said simply, "Now I recognize my friend. Call me sometime." Dean kept that telegram in his wallet for the rest of his life. Frank Sinatra, characteristically, was more direct. One night at a private dinner, just the two of them and too much wine, Frank looked at Dean and said, "You know what I admired about you for all those years? The armor. The way nothing ever seemed to touch you. And you know what I admire about you now?" Dean waited. "The fact that you finally took the damn armor off." The incident became a turning point, though not in the way anyone expected. Dean's career didn't collapse, if anything, it entered a new phase. His performances took on a different quality, more intimate and less polished. He started choosing songs with more emotional weight, material that reflected actual human experiences rather than just showcasing vocal technique. The NBC breakdown, as it came to be known in industry circles, also changed the landscape of television itself. It demonstrated that audiences were hungry for authenticity, for moments of genuine human emotion, even from, especially from, larger-than-life entertainers. Within a few years, late-night hosts were sharing personal stories, variety shows were featuring more candid moments, and the carefully controlled perfection of 1960s television began giving way to something rawer. But for Dean personally, the most important change was internal. He started spending more time with his children, making their schedules a priority instead of an afterthought. He turned down lucrative Vegas residencies that would have kept him away from home for months. He began saying no to projects that didn't interest him, regardless of the paycheck, and yes to smaller things that felt meaningful. His friends noticed he smiled more, and that the smiles seemed to reach his eyes now. The carefully maintained cool was still there when he needed it, on stage, in public appearances, during performances. But it was a tool he picked up and put down, rather than a mask he wore every waking moment. Years later, in 1987, Dean did an interview with Tom Snyder where the host asked about that night in 1968. Dean was 70 years old by then, his face weathered by time and loss. He'd buried his son Dean Paul in 1987, a grief that made the hospital scare of 1968 seem almost quaint in comparison. But when Snyder asked about the breakdown, Dean's response was simple and clear. "Best thing I ever did on television," he said without hesitation. "Really?" Snyder seemed surprised. "But it was. I mean, you were vulnerable. Out of control." "Exactly," Dean replied. "For years, I'd been this guy who never showed any cracks, never admitted to struggling with anything. And that night, I couldn't keep it up anymore. So I didn't. And you know what I learned? People don't need you to be perfect. They need you to be honest." He paused, looked directly into the camera with those tired, wise eyes. "And I needed that too. To be honest. To admit that underneath the tuxedo and the songs and all the showbiz stuff, I was just a father who was scared for his kid." The footage of that 1968 breakdown has been replayed countless times over the decades. Film students analyze it in classes about television history. Pop culture documentaries use it as a watershed moment in the evolution of celebrity culture. But the most powerful legacy isn't in the archives or the analyses. It's in the letters that Dean received for the rest of his life, letters from fathers who'd been moved by his honesty, from performers who'd felt permission to show their own vulnerability, from ordinary people who'd felt less alone in their struggles because Dean Martin had shown them his. One letter, which Dean kept in a drawer in his bedroom, came from a man in Ohio who'd written, "I watched you break down that night, and I thought about all the times I'd held my own feelings inside because I thought that's what men were supposed to do. Seeing you be real like that, it changed something in me. I called my own father the next day for the first time in 3 years. Thank you for showing us that being strong sometimes means admitting when you're scared." Dean never framed that letter or showed it to anyone. But sometimes, late at night, he'd take it out and read it, and remember that moment when everything fell apart on live television, and how that falling apart had somehow, impossibly, been the most important performance of his career. The truth is, Dean Martin spent most of his life perfecting the art of looking effortless. He made singing seem easy, charm seem natural, and coolness seem like something he was born with rather than something he cultivated. That was the performance that made him a star, that filled nightclubs and sold millions of records. But it was the night he stopped performing, the night he couldn't perform, that revealed who he really was. And in that revelation, in those 4 seconds of terrible silence and the cracked voice that followed, Dean Martin gave his audience something more valuable than entertainment. He gave them permission to be human.